I was driving south on Interstate 90 when my phone lit up on the passenger seat. Traffic was light, the sky over eastern Washington washed in that pale winter gray that makes everything feel unfinished. I almost ignored the call. I had learned over the years that answering family calls without preparation was a gamble. Still, when I saw the name, my thumb moved before my mind caught up. It was my Aunt Lorraine. She never called unless something was already decided without me. "Clara," she said, her voice careful rehearsed. "I didn't know how else to tell you." That sentence alone tightened something in my chest. "Tell me what," I asked, keeping my eyes on the road. There was a pause. I could hear a television murmuring in the background, the clink of a spoon against a mug. Ordinary sounds, the kind that always accompanied moments that changed things. "Your parents finalized the trust this morning," she said. "They moved the signing up." I didn't answer right away. The word trust hung in the air between us, heavy and familiar. For years, it had been used like a promise. Something abstract, something for later, something I was told not to worry about because we're family. "That's fine," I said finally. "They told me it would be next month." Another pause, longer this time. "They signed it without you," Lorraine said. "Your brother was there, the lawyer, your parents. You weren't included." The road blurred for a second. Not because I was crying. I wasn't. My body had learned long ago how to go very still when something sharp passed through it. "I wasn't included," I repeated more to myself than to her. Lorraine exhaled. "They said you were too emotional, that it would complicate things." I pulled onto the shoulder without realizing I had done it. Gravel crunched under the tires. A semi roared past, wind rocking my car slightly, but I barely noticed. "They said I was too emotional," I said. Yes, there it was. The explanation that had followed me since childhood. The label that made every decision easier for them. Emotional, difficult, sensitive. Words that sounded concerned but functioned like a lock. I thanked her. I don't remember why. Habit, maybe? Or the instinct to make other people comfortable even when they were delivering bad news. When the call ended, I sat there with both hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. No tears, no shaking, just a low, spreading understanding that this wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. This was a decision. Growing up, I had believed my parents loved me. Not in the loud way they loved my brother Evan with his effortless charm and clean edges, but in a quieter way. A way that came with advice instead of praise. Corrections instead of encouragement. They worried about me. That was how it was framed. They worried I would say the wrong thing at dinner, that I would make people uncomfortable, that I would ask questions that didn't need to be asked, that I would notice things it was easier to ignore. When I was 12, my mother once pulled me aside before a Christmas party and said, "Just smile tonight. Don't get into anything heavy." I didn't know what heavy meant, but I learned quickly. By my mid-20s, I had learned to speak carefully around them, to edit myself, to present a version that wouldn't cause concern. I thought that was what being an adult daughter meant. Compromise, flexibility, trust. The trust, it turned out, only went one way. I drove the rest of the way home in silence. No radio, no calls. I let the realization settle fully before I allowed myself to react. They hadn't excluded me from a conversation. They hadn't forgotten to invite me to a meeting. They had legally removed me from a future that had been described for years as shared. And they had done it calmly, quietly, with justification. That night, I opened my email and searched for the last message from my father about the trust. I found it easily. "Don't worry about paperwork," he had written. "We'll handle it as a family." I read it twice, then closed my laptop. The next morning, I requested a copy of the finalized documents from the law office listed in Lorraine's contact. I didn't explain. I didn't accuse. I simply asked. The assistant replied within an hour. I was not listed as a beneficiary. Not directly, not indirectly, not contingently. Everything had been placed into a structure controlled by my parents and eventually my brother. My name appeared once in a clause describing potential interference by external parties. External parties. I sat at my kitchen table with the document printed out in front of me, coffee, untouched sunlight creeping across the floor. I felt something shift then, not anger, not grief. Clarity. This wasn't about inheritance, it wasn't about money, it was about control. They had decided without telling me that my role in the family was not to participate, but to be managed. They had loved me, but only in ways that didn't require them to trust my judgment. I folded the papers carefully and placed them back in the envelope. For the first time, I understood something I had never allowed myself to think before. The affection I grew up with had always come with conditions. And the moment I stopped fitting neatly inside them, I stopped being included. I didn't call my parents that day. I didn't confront them. I didn't ask why. I did something else instead. I opened my laptop again and searched for a lawyer. I didn't choose the lawyer based on reputation alone. I chose her because she didn't flinch when I explained why I was calling. Her name was Dana Mercer. Mid-40s, calm voice, no unnecessary sympathy. When I told her my parents had executed a trust without notifying me, she didn't interrupt or rush to conclusions. She asked questions, precise ones. When was the last time you were told you'd be included? Do you have anything in writing? Have you ever signed a waiver or consent? I answered each one slowly, carefully. By the time I finished, my coffee had gone cold again. Dana paused. I could hear papers shifting on her end. This isn't unusual, she said finally. But that doesn't mean it's clean. What does that mean? I asked. It means families often confuse authority with consent, she replied, especially when one child is easier to manage than the other. I stared out my kitchen window at the bare maple tree in the yard. Its branches were stark, stripped down to structure. So what can I do? I asked. She didn't give me a dramatic answer. No promises, no righteous outrage. You can understand your position, she said, and then you can decide whether you want to accept it or change it. Change it. The word sat with me long after we hung up. Over the next week, I didn't say anything to my parents. I went to work. I answered emails. I attended meetings. I smiled at the right moments. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. I began noticing things I had trained myself not to see. How my mother always spoke for me when we were together. How my father framed decisions as already made, then asked for agreement. How Evan never asked my opinion but expected my support. The imbalance had always been there. I had mistaken it for family dynamics, normal differences, personality clashes. It wasn't any of that. It was hierarchy. The first crack came on Sunday. My parents invited me to dinner. The invitation was casual, last minute, as if nothing significant had occurred. I almost declined, but curiosity pulled me in. I wanted to see how they carried this decision in their bodies, whether they were nervous, defensive, guilty. They weren't. Dinner was roast chicken and vegetables. My mother asked about work. My father talked about the neighborhood association. Evan checked his phone and commented occasionally. At one point, my mother smiled at me and said, "We're so glad you're doing well, Clara. Stability suits you." Stability. I realized then that they believed they had done the right thing, that excluding me wasn't cruelty in their minds but precaution. After dessert, my father cleared his throat. "We finalized the trust this week," he said, as if announcing a landscaping project. "Everything's settled now." I looked at him, I know. A flicker crossed his face. Surprise quickly smoothed over. "Oh," he said. "Lorraine must have mentioned it." "Yes," I said. "She did." My mother folded her napkin carefully. "We didn't want to burden you with legal complexity," she said. "These things can be stressful." I waited, let the silence stretch. And my father prompted. And what I asked. "Aren't you going to say anything?" Evan asked, finally looking up. I considered them, really looked. They weren't braced for conflict. They were braced for reassurance. They expected me to smooth this over, to tell them I understood, that I trusted them, that everything was fine. "I've already spoken to a lawyer," I said. The air changed instantly. My mother's hand froze mid-motion. My father's expression hardened. "Why would you do that?" he asked. "Because I wasn't included," I said evenly. "And I wanted to understand what that meant." Evan scoffed. "This is exactly what they were worried about." I turned to him. "What were they worried about?" "That you'd overreact," he said. "Turn this into something it isn't." I nodded. "And what is it?" My father leaned back. "It's a family decision." "So was excluding me," I said. "But I wasn't consulted." My mother's voice softened. "We know you, Clara. You don't handle uncertainty well." There it was again, emotional, difficult, unstable. "I handle being informed just fine," I said. "What I don't handle is being managed." My father's jaw tightened. "You're reading too much into this." "No," I said. "I'm reading exactly what's written." Silence followed, heavy, uncomfortable. Then my father said, "If you make this adversarial, you'll regret it." It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. The kind given by people who believe they still hold leverage. I stood up. "I didn't come here to argue," I said. "I came to listen. And I've heard enough." My mother reached for my arm. "Don't do anything drastic." I gently stepped back. "You already did." I left without raising my voice. without demanding explanations, without asking for anything. That night, I emailed Dana again. "I want to proceed," I wrote. "I want to understand all my options." She replied within minutes. "Then we'll start by documenting everything," she wrote. "And then we'll decide what silence is worth." For the first time in my life, silence felt like a tool instead of a weakness. I stopped initiating contact with my parents. I didn't block them. I didn't announce distance. I simply stopped showing up automatically. They noticed. My mother called twice in one day, left voicemails asking if I was upset, if something was wrong. I didn't respond. A week later, Evan texted, "Can you not make this weird?" I stared at the message for a long time. This was the moment I understood the final piece. They didn't see me as a person with agency. They saw me as an atmosphere to manage, a variable to control so everything else could stay the same. And now that I wasn't cooperating, the system was destabilizing. Dana walked me through the trust documents line by line. She explained how my exclusion wasn't illegal, but the process could be challenged under certain conditions. Not because I was owed something, but because transparency had been deliberately avoided. "They assumed you wouldn't question it," she said. "They were right," I replied, "until they weren't." I didn't know yet what action I would take. That came later. But something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer waiting to be included. I was preparing to choose what I would no longer accept. And for the first time, that felt like control. Once you notice control, you start seeing it everywhere. It's not dramatic. That's the part people misunderstand. Control doesn't arrive screaming. It settles in quietly, dressed as concern, masked as love, reinforced by habit. It relies on your willingness to doubt yourself. In the days after that dinner, I replayed moments from my life. The way you replay a conversation after realizing the person across from you was lying. There was the job offer I turned down in my early 20s because my mother said the city wasn't safe for someone like me. The apartment I never rented because my father warned it might become a distraction. The relationship I let fade because Evan joked that the guy seemed too intense for me, and everyone laughed like it was nothing. At the time, I thought I was choosing peace, maturity, compromise. Now I saw the pattern. I was allowed independence only as long as it didn't threaten the structure they were comfortable with. Dana called it soft containment. "They don't restrict you openly," she said during one of our calls. "They shape the perimeter until you stop testing the fence." That hit harder than I expected, because it was true. I had stopped testing the fence a long time ago. At work, things were shifting too, though, in a different way. I worked as a project manager for a mid-sized development firm, nothing glamorous but stable. I was good at it. Quietly effective. The kind of person people relied on without thinking much about. 2 weeks after the trust dinner, my supervisor called me into her office. "Have you ever thought about applying for the regional lead position?" she asked. I hadn't, not seriously. "It's a bigger role," she continued. "More visibility, more authority." Authority. The word made something tighten in my chest. Not fear, recognition. "I assumed you weren't interested," she added. "You tend to keep your head down." That night I went home and stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror longer than usual. Keeping my head down had become my default posture, not just with my family but everywhere. It was safer, less friction, fewer expectations. But it had also made me easy to overlook. The following weekend, my parents hosted a small gathering, neighbors, a few relatives, nothing formal. I hadn't been invited directly, but my mother mentioned it casually on a voicemail as if assuming I'd come. I didn't. Instead, I went through old boxes in my apartment. Documents, letters, photos. Things I'd never bothered to organize because they belonged to a version of my life I hadn't questioned. I found a copy of my grandmother's handwritten will from years earlier, leaving a modest sum to each grandchild. At the bottom in shaky script was a note. "To Clara because she listens." I hadn't thought about that note in years. My grandmother had died when I was in college. Afterward, my parents handled everything. I trusted them. I never asked how things were distributed. It didn't seem necessary. Now I wondered. I emailed Dana a scan of the document. "Can you check if this was ever executed?" I asked. Her reply came the next day. "It was superseded by a later version," she wrote. "One you weren't named in." I sat back in my chair, heart steady, mind sharp. This wasn't new behavior. This was consistency. They hadn't just excluded me once. They had done it whenever it was convenient, whenever my presence complicated their narrative of harmony. I thought of how often my mother said, "Let's not stir things up," of how my father equated calm with control, of how Evan thrived in that system because it favored confidence over conscience. I wasn't angry yet. That came later. What I felt then was something colder. Assessment. I started documenting everything. Dates, conversations, emails, offhand comments that revealed assumptions about my role. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't accuse. I observed. Silence, I was learning, made people careless. My parents began calling more frequently. My mother asked if I was overwhelmed. My father asked if work was stressing me out. Neither asked why I'd pulled back. They weren't curious about my inner life. They were monitoring compliance. One evening, Evan showed up at my apartment unannounced. "You're freaking them out," he said, standing in my doorway like he belonged there. "I didn't realize I needed permission to be quiet," I replied. He sighed. "You know how they are." "Yes," I said, "I do. They think you're planning something." I met his eyes. "Are they worried I'll ask questions?" His jaw tightened. "You're always looking for something to be wrong." There it was again, the narrative. I opened the door wider. "You should go." He stared at me, surprised. "Seriously?" "Yes." He left without another word. That night I slept better than I had in weeks. Dana and I met in person for the first time shortly after. Her office was minimalist. No family photos, no inspirational quotes, just clean lines and clear space. "Here's the reality," she said, laying out the options. "You can challenge the trust. It won't be quick, it won't be comfortable, and it will permanently change your relationship with your family." "I know," I said. Or she continued, "You can leverage your exclusion." I raised an eyebrow. "How?" "By removing yourself entirely from the system they built," she said. "Emotionally, practically, legally." I thought about that on the drive home. Removing myself didn't mean disappearing. It meant stepping out of reach. Over the next month, I made decisions I hadn't told my family about. I applied for the regional lead position. I moved my savings into an account my parents had no visibility into. I updated my emergency contacts. I changed the narrative at work, taking on more visible responsibility. Each step was small, rational, unemotional, but together they shifted the balance. When my parents finally confronted me, it wasn't with anger. It was with confusion. "You seem distant," my mother said over the phone. "Have we done something to upset you?" I could hear the subtext, the expectation that I would reassure her. "I didn't. I'm recalibrating," I said. There was a long pause. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means I'm deciding what role I want to play in my own life," I replied. She didn't like that answer. I hung up before she could redirect the conversation. For the first time, I understood something essential. They didn't fear my anger. They feared my independence. And once I saw that clearly, there was no going back. Because the moment you realize love was conditional, you stop negotiating for it. You start building something else instead. The first time my parents asked me to come to a family meeting, I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the phrase itself carried a history. In our family meetings weren't for discussion. They were for alignment. A way to bring everyone back into formation when someone drifted. I didn't respond right away. 3 days later, my father left a voicemail. His voice was calm, measured the way he sounded when he believed reason was on his side. "We're concerned," he said. "You've been distant. This isn't healthy. Let's sit down and clear the air." Clear the air. Another familiar phrase. One that usually meant my feelings would be acknowledged briefly, then reframed as misunderstanding. I deleted the message. That was when the tone shifted. My mother began calling in the mornings, her voice softer, almost fragile. She asked if I was eating well, if work was overwhelming, if I felt lonely. None of the questions were really questions. They were probes checking whether I was still reachable through guilt. Evan texted that same week. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be." I didn't answer. Silence. I was learning unsettles people who rely on reaction. At work, the interview for the regional lead position came faster than expected. 2 senior managers, a glass-walled conference room, a stack of printed proposals I had prepared myself. Halfway through, one of them leaned back and said, "You don't usually put yourself forward like this." I met his gaze. "That's changing." I didn't over-explain, I didn't justify. When I got the offer 2 days later, I accepted without hesitation. It came with a salary increase, expanded authority, and most importantly, autonomy. Decisions would be mine. Accountability would be direct. I didn't tell my parents. The shift in me was subtle, but they felt it. People who are used to having access always do. My mother showed up at my apartment one afternoon without warning. I opened the door and saw her standing there, purse clutched tight, eyes scanning my face for signs of weakness. "We were worried," she said. "You haven't been answering." "I've been busy," I replied. She stepped inside without asking, the way she always had. I let her. I wanted to see how far she'd go when she realized the rules had changed. She sat at my kitchen table, smoothing her coat, glancing around as if something might be wrong with the space itself. "This distance," she said carefully, "it feels like punishment." I leaned against the counter. "It's not punishment." "Then what is it?" "It's space," I said. "Something I should have had a long time ago." Her mouth tightened. "We did everything to protect you." There it was. Protection. The justification for every decision I hadn't been allowed to make. From what I asked. She hesitated. "From stress, from conflict, from your own tendencies." "My tendencies," I repeated. "You're sensitive," she said. "You take things personally." I nodded slowly. "And because of that you decided things for me." "We knew what was best," she said. "No," I replied. "You knew what was easiest." Her eyes flashed. "That's unfair." I didn't argue. That was the moment she realized something was wrong. Normally I would have softened, reassured her, pulled the conversation back toward harmony. This time I didn't. She stood abruptly. "Your father won't like this." I almost smiled. "I'm not asking him to," I said. After she left, I sat at the table for a long time, breathing evenly. I felt steady, grounded, not triumphant, just clear. That evening Dana called. "They've requested a copy of your correspondence with me," she said. I frowned. "On what basis?" "They're claiming concern about your mental state," she replied flatly. "It's a phishing attempt." Something inside me hardened. "They're escalating," I said. "Yes," Dana agreed, "and that tells me something important." "What?" "They're afraid of losing control," she said. "And people who are afraid make mistakes." 2 days later, my father called. "I heard you're making changes at work," he said. "Big ones." "Work offered," I replied. "I accepted." "You should have talked to us first." I laughed quietly. "Why?" "So we could advise you," he said. "I didn't need advice," I replied. "I needed authority." His voice cooled. "You're behaving recklessly." "I'm behaving independently." There was a long silence. "You're forgetting who you are," he said finally. "No," I said, "I'm remembering." That night I drafted a formal letter with Dana's help. It was brief, polite, precise. It stated that all communication regarding family assets, legal structures, or future planning was to go through counsel. It requested no further informal contact on those matters. I didn't send it immediately. I waited. 3 days later, Evan showed up again. This time he didn't knock. "You can't just cut them out," he said, anger slipping through his usual confidence. "I didn't," I replied. "They cut me out. I adjusted." "You're going to blow this up," he said. I looked at him, really looked. For the first time I saw fear behind his frustration. Not for me, for himself. "You benefit from this system as it is," I said. "Of course you want it preserved." "That's not fair." "Neither was excluding me," I replied. He shook his head. "You're going to regret this." "Maybe," I said, "but it will be my regret." After he left, I sent the letter. The response was immediate. My father called twice, my mother emailed, Evan texted. I didn't reply. Instead, I sat down and made a list. Practical things. What documents I needed copies of. What accounts needed separation. What boundaries had to be formalized. This wasn't revenge. It was reorganization. The realization came quietly without drama. My silence wasn't withdrawal. It was leverage. And they knew it. The letter did exactly what Dana said it would do. It forced everything into the open. Within 48 hours, my parents' attorney reached out, tone courteous, language neutral, requesting a conversation to clarify misunderstandings. That word again. Misunderstandings. As if years of decisions made without me were the result of crossed wires, not intent. Dana handled the response. She agreed to a meeting on record with minutes documented, no side conversations, no emotional framing. When she told me the date, I felt nothing. Not dread, not anticipation, just readiness. The night before the meeting, I slept soundly. That surprised me. In the past, even the hint of conflict with my family would leave me restless, replaying conversations that hadn't happened yet, rehearsing explanations no one asked for. This time my mind was quiet. Because I wasn't going to explain myself, I was going to listen. The meeting took place in a conference room downtown. Neutral ground, glass table, muted carpet, a view of traffic below. My parents arrived together, composed, dressed the way they always did for anything involving authority. My father nodded at me once. My mother smiled tightly. Evan wasn't there. That told me more than his presence ever could have. Their attorney spoke first, outlining the trust structure, emphasizing legality, intention, family harmony. Dana listened, without interrupting, pen still. When it was my turn, I didn't speak. Dana did. She asked simple questions. Why was I not notified prior to execution? Why was I excluded from beneficiary status without consultation? Why had previous representations suggested inclusion? My father answered carefully. My mother watched him, lips pressed together. They said they acted in good faith. They said they believed I would be relieved. They said they wanted to avoid conflict. Dana nodded, wrote something down. Then she asked the question that changed the temperature in the room. Can you provide documentation where Clara consented to being excluded? Silence. My father cleared his throat. We didn't think consent was necessary. Dana looked up. That assumption is noted. I watched my parents closely then, not with anger, with distance. They were used to being deferred to, used to authority flowing outward from them without resistance. This was new terrain. When the meeting ended, no conclusions were reached, no decisions reversed, but something had shifted. On the way out, my mother touched my arm. We did what we thought was best, she said softly. I looked at her hand on my sleeve. I know, I replied. That's the problem. After that, the pressure changed shape. It became social. Relatives began reaching out. A cousin asking if everything was okay. An uncle suggesting I should let things go. Lorraine called once, voice uneasy, saying she hoped we could all move past this. I listened. I thanked them. I didn't explain. Explaining invites negotiation. I wasn't negotiating anymore. At work, the new role demanded more of me. Longer hours, sharper decisions. I thrived in it. Not because I was proving something, but because no one questioned my right to be there. That difference mattered. One afternoon, my father called my office. The receptionist transferred the call automatically, unaware of the boundary I had drawn. When I heard his voice, I didn't hang up. I heard you've been promoted, he said. Yes, I replied. You didn't mention it. I didn't need to. A pause. You're changing, he said. So are you, I replied. You're just not used to noticing. He exhaled sharply. You're risking everything over pride. That word, pride, the favorite accusation when compliance ends. I'm risking nothing, I said. I already lost what mattered. What's that supposed to mean? It means I stopped mistaking access for care, I said. He didn't respond. That evening, Dana forwarded me an internal memo from the opposing counsel. It wasn't meant for me. She'd obtained it through proper channels. It described me as unpredictable and emotionally motivated. It suggested delaying tactics until I stabilized. I read it twice, then closed the file. There it was, in writing. The same narrative dressed in legal language. Dana called shortly after. They're positioning to wait you out, she said. They think you'll tire, that you'll back down. I won't, I said. I know, she replied. That's why I want to discuss next steps. The next steps weren't dramatic. No lawsuits, no public confrontations. They were strategic. We began preparing a formal request for accounting. A detailed inventory of all assets tied to family trusts, prior distributions, modifications over time. Perfectly legal, perfectly reasonable. Time-consuming, expensive, inconvenient. Dana explained it plainly. This forces transparency, and transparency disrupts systems built on quiet control. I approved it. When the request was filed, the response from my parents was immediate. My mother called, voice shaking, accusing me of trying to destroy the family. My father emailed warning of consequences. Evan texted a single line. You've gone too far. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I sat at my desk that night, reviewing documents, highlighting inconsistencies, noting patterns. I felt something then that I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, relief. Because for the first time, my actions matched what I felt. I wasn't pretending harmony existed where it didn't. I wasn't shrinking to preserve an image that excluded me anyway. I was choosing clarity over comfort. And clarity has a cost. You lose access. You lose approval. You lose the illusion that love once given is unconditional. But you gain something else. You gain authorship. And once you have that, you stop fearing what compliance was costing you all along. The accounting request didn't just slow things down. It exposed them. Dana warned me about this phase. This is where behavior changes, she said. When quiet pressure stops working. She was right. Within days, my parents' tone shifted from concerned to indignant. The emails from their attorney became clipped defensive, requests for extensions, objections framed as procedural fatigue. Too broad, too intrusive, too burdensome. Dana countered each one calmly. This is standard, she wrote back, and required. Meanwhile, the family narrative escalated. I stopped being sensitive and became ungrateful. I wasn't confused anymore, I was vindictive. It was almost impressive how quickly concern turned into character assassination once compliance was no longer an option. I learned about most of it secondhand. A colleague whose spouse attended the same charity board as my mother mentioned casually that Helen seemed very worried about her daughter. Another acquaintance hinted that my father felt betrayed. Betrayed? By asking questions. I didn't correct anyone, I didn't defend myself, I let the story travel without me. At first, that was uncomfortable. There's a deep instinct, especially in women, to clarify, to soften, to make sure we're understood. I had lived inside that instinct my whole life. Letting go of it felt like standing still while a wave passed through me. But once it did, I noticed something important. The people who mattered didn't need explanations, and the people who demanded them never intended to listen. 2 weeks into the process, Dana called me late one afternoon. "They've retained a forensic accountant," she said. "That sounds serious," I replied. "It is," she said, "but not in the way they think." She explained that bringing in an external accountant meant everything would be examined. Not just the trust I was excluded from, but earlier transactions. Transfers, revisions, decisions made years ago under the assumption no one would ever ask. "Systems built on silence don't age well under scrutiny," Dana said. That night, my mother showed up again. This time she knocked. I opened the door and saw her standing there, eyes red, posture tense, like she was bracing for impact. "We need to talk," she said. "I'm listening," I replied, but I didn't invite her in. She glanced past me into the apartment, as if searching for reassurance that nothing had changed. When she realized she wasn't coming inside, her mouth tightened. "You're tearing us apart," she said. I leaned against the doorframe. "No," I stopped holding it together. She flinched. "That's cruel." "It's accurate," I replied. Her voice rose. "Do you have any idea what people are saying?" I nodded. "I can imagine." "And you're just letting it happen?" "Yes." Her eyes filled with tears. "We raised you better than this." I studied her face. The lines I had memorized since childhood. The expressions that once dictated my behavior. "You raised me to be manageable," I said, "not autonomous." She shook her head. "You're rewriting history." "No," I said quietly. "I'm finally reading it." She stared at me for a long moment, then turned away abruptly, shoulders stiff. As she walked down the hall, she said without looking back, "You'll regret this when it's too late." I closed the door gently. At work, the regional lead role put me in direct contact with upper management in ways I hadn't experienced before. One afternoon during a strategy meeting, the CEO asked me for my recommendation on a project that had stalled for months. I gave it, clearly, decisively. Afterward, one of the senior directors pulled me aside. "You don't hesitate," he said. "That's rare." I thought about that later. I had hesitated my entire life, just not in places where it was safe to hesitate. The forensic accounting process took time, but its effects were immediate. Requests for documentation piled up. Old decisions had to be justified. Explanations had to be consistent. They weren't. Dana didn't share details unless necessary, but I could hear the shift in her voice when she called. "They're uncomfortable," she said once. "And uncomfortable people rush." The rush came in the form of an offer. My father emailed me directly, bypassing counsel. "We're willing to revisit the trust," he wrote, "if you agree to pause further action." It was framed as compromise. It was leverage. I forwarded it to Dana without replying. Her response was brief. "Do not engage." A few days later, Evan called. I hadn't heard his voice in weeks. "This is spiraling," he said. "Dad's under a lot of pressure." "I know," I replied. "You could stop it," he said. "Just say you're satisfied." I leaned back in my chair, satisfied with what? "With being acknowledged," he said, with a gesture. "A gesture," I repeated. "Don't be difficult," he snapped. I felt something then, not anger, not hurt. Distance. "You're asking me to lie," I said. "So things can go back to the way they were." "That's how families survive," he said. "No," I replied. "That's how systems persist." He went quiet. "You're not the victim here," he said finally. "I never said I was," I replied. "I said I was done." When the call ended, I sat there for a long time, phone resting in my hand. This was the moment many people fold. Not because they're wrong, but because the pressure becomes personal, emotional, relational. This is where fear is supposed to override principle. But something had changed in me. I wasn't fighting for inclusion anymore. I was protecting my right to choose. And the more they pushed, the clearer it became. They didn't want resolution. They wanted restoration. They wanted the version of me that absorbed discomfort so they wouldn't have to. That version wasn't coming back. Not now. Not ever. The first real offer came on a Tuesday morning. Not through lawyers, not through email. Through my grandmother. She was my mother's mother, well into her 80s, gentle in a way that had once felt like safety. When her name appeared on my phone, I answered without thinking. Old habits die quietly. "Clara," she said, her voice thin but warm. "I wish this family knew how to stop hurting each other." I closed my eyes. They were using her. "I wish that too," I said carefully. She sighed. "Your father came by yesterday. He looked so tired." Of course he did. He was losing control, and that always looked like exhaustion on him. He said this situation could be resolved, she continued, if everyone would just be reasonable. There it was, the word that always meant one person was expected to bend. Reasonable, how, I asked. A pause, a breath. They're willing to put you back into the trust, she said, formally, in writing. I didn't react, I waited. But she added quickly, they need you to stop all this legal business. It's making people nervous. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. This was it. The trade. Inclusion in exchange for silence. A conditional seat at the table granted only if I promised not to look too closely at how the table had been built. They want me compliant, I said. They want peace, my grandmother replied. No, I said gently, they want quiet. She sounded confused. Isn't that the same thing? No, I said. Peace doesn't require erasing someone. She didn't answer. I love you, she said finally. I just don't want to see you alone in this. I'm not alone, I replied. After we hung up, I sat still for a long time. The offer wasn't tempting because of the money. It was tempting because of what it symbolized. Recognition, acknowledgement, proof that they had been wrong to exclude me. But it was hollow, because it wasn't rooted in accountability. It was rooted in fear. Dana confirmed that later that afternoon. They're trying to reset the power dynamic, she said. They're offering you conditional inclusion to regain leverage. What happens if I accept, I asked. They'll comply just enough to stop scrutiny, she said, and then they'll go back to managing you. I thought about my grandmother's voice, about how carefully the offer had been framed, about how quickly peace had been equated with my silence. I won't accept it, I said. Dana didn't sound surprised. I didn't think you would. The backlash was immediate. My mother left a voicemail that night crying openly, accusing me of tearing the family apart when they were trying to fix things. My father followed with a message colder than anything he'd sent before. If you reject this olive branch, he said, don't expect another. It wasn't an olive branch. It was a leash. The next escalation came at work. A senior partner pulled me aside after a meeting and asked delicately whether everything was all right at home. He said he'd heard things. I asked what things. He hesitated. Concerns about your stability. I nodded. Thank you for telling me. I went straight to human resources and documented the conversation. Names, dates, language used. When people try to discredit you quietly, you respond by making things visible. Dana was pleased when I told her. Good, she said. They're slipping. The forensic accountant's preliminary report came in shortly after. There were inconsistencies, transfers that hadn't been properly documented, amendments executed without full disclosure to all interested parties. Nothing explosive yet, but enough to make the air heavy, enough to make people nervous. Evan called again that week, his voice sharper this time. You could end this tomorrow, he said. You're choosing not to. Yes, I replied. Why, he demanded. I considered the question. Because if I accept their terms now, I said I'll be telling myself that my silence is worth more than my integrity. He laughed bitterly. Integrity doesn't pay bills. It does, I said, just not theirs. He hung up. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, lights, off-city glow filtering through the windows. I thought about the younger version of myself, the one who believed that if she were patient enough, gentle enough, agreeable enough, she would eventually be chosen without conditions. That girl would have taken the offer. She would have told herself it was resolution. She would have swallowed the discomfort and called it maturity. I wasn't her anymore. The next morning, Dana sent the formal response declining the offer and confirming that the accounting process would continue. My parents' attorney replied within hours. They were disappointed. I almost laughed. Disappointment was what they called it when control failed. The real turning point came 2 days later when the accountant requested documents related to a property transfer from years earlier. One I vaguely remembered being discussed as temporary. It wasn't temporary. It had been moved out of the trust quietly, then folded back in under a different structure. A structure that benefited Evan exclusively. Dana didn't speculate. She didn't editorialize. She simply said, "This explains the urgency." That evening, my father showed up at my door. No warning, no buffer. Just him standing there, face tight, eyes sharp. "We need to talk," he said. "No," I replied calmly. "You need to listen." He stared at me, stunned. "I gave you a way out," he said. "You gave me a bargain," I replied. I declined. "You don't understand what you're risking," he snapped. "I do," I said. "I'm risking access to people who only value me when I'm quiet." He stepped closer. "You're destroying this family." I didn't move. "No," I said. "I'm exposing it." For a moment, something raw crossed his face, not remorse. Fear. That was when I knew. This wasn't about inheritance anymore. This was about what would happen if the truth came all the way out. And they were running out of ways to stop it. Fear changes people in predictable ways. Some get louder, some get cruel, some pretend nothing is happening and hope the storm passes them by. My parents did none of those things. They went quiet. Dana noticed it before I did. Emails slowed. Objections stopped arriving on schedule. Requests for extensions went unanswered. They're regrouping, she said. Or they're out of moves. I didn't respond right away. I was sitting at my desk at work, staring at a spreadsheet I hadn't touched in 10 minutes. Outside my office window, the city moved on indifferent to family implosions and legal maneuvering. What happens if they're out of moves, I asked. Dana paused. Then the truth finishes what pressure started. The forensic accountant's second report arrived that afternoon. This one wasn't careful, it was precise. It outlined a pattern of asset reallocation that had been repeated over more than a decade, each time the same justification. Efficiency, simplicity, protection, each time the same outcome. Consolidation of control under my parents with Evan positioned as the eventual successor. I wasn't named in those documents at all, not as an oversight, as a risk. The language was clinical, but the implication was unmistakable. My exclusion wasn't reactive, it was strategic. I closed the file and leaned back in my chair. This wasn't about me being difficult. This was about me being unpredictable. At home that night, I poured a glass of water and sat on the floor with my back against the couch. I didn't turn on any lights. I let the quiet stretch. Quiet. I thought about every time I had been told to calm down, to let things go, to trust the process. The process, it turned out, was designed to function without me. My phone buzzed once. A text from Evan. "We need to talk now." I didn't answer. 10 minutes later, my mother called. I let it ring. When the voicemail came through, her voice sounded different. Not tearful, not angry. Controlled. "Clara," she said, "your father is very upset. This has gone too far. We need to fix this before it becomes irreversible." Irreversible. I deleted the message. Dana called shortly after. "They're requesting mediation," she said, formal, with a neutral third party. "That's new," I said. "Yes," she agreed. "That's panic." I stared at the wall, watching the shadow of a passing car slide across it. "What do you recommend?" I asked. She didn't hesitate. We proceed. The mediation was scheduled for the following week. Neutral office, neutral mediator, everything structured to look reasonable. My parents arrived early. Evan sat beside them this time, jaw tight, leg bouncing. He didn't look at me. The mediator explained the rules. Respectful communication. One person speaking at a time. Focus on resolution. Resolution. My father spoke first. He talked about family legacy, about intentions, about misunderstandings compounded by legal overreach. He spoke as if the past were a series of unfortunate coincidences rather than deliberate choices. When it was my turn, I didn't argue. I asked questions. Why was I excluded from every revision of the trust? Why were asset transfers executed without disclosure? Why was my consent never sought but my compliance always assumed? The mediator shifted uncomfortably. My mother tried to interrupt. The mediator stopped her. Evan finally spoke. "You don't understand what this does to us," he said. "You're tearing down everything we built." I looked at him calmly. "What did you build?" I asked. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The mediator asked if there was a path forward. Dana answered. "Yes," she said. "Full transparency, independent restructuring, equal footing." My father's face hardened. "That's not acceptable," he said. Dana nodded. "Then we proceed as we are." The session ended without agreement. Outside, Evan caught up to me in the hallway. "You won't win this," he said quietly. "I already have," I replied. He stared at me like he didn't recognize me anymore. That was fine. I barely recognized myself either. 2 days later, the shift became public. Not in headlines, not in gossip, in action. My father's bank flagged several accounts tied to the trust for review. Standard procedure once certain thresholds are crossed. The accountant's findings had triggered compliance checks. Routine. Unavoidable. The call started immediately. My father, my mother, Evan. I didn't answer. Dana did. By the end of the week, their attorney requested a suspension of certain transfers pending investigation. My father's control was no longer assumed. It was being examined. That night, I stood in my kitchen, hands resting on the counter, breathing slowly. I felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not victory, relief, because the worst thing had already happened. I had been excluded. I had been labeled. I had been quietly written out of a future I was told not to worry about. Everything after that was just consequence. Evan showed up again late that night. I opened the door and saw him standing there, shoulders slumped, eyes bloodshot. "They're blaming you," he said. "I know," I replied. They think you planned this. I shook my head. I responded to it. He swallowed. If things collapse. They won't collapse, I said. They'll change. He looked at me, then really looked, and something like fear crossed his face. You're not backing down, he said. No, I replied. He nodded once, like someone finally accepting gravity, then turned and walked away. I closed the door and leaned against it. For years, I had been afraid of losing my place in my family. Now I understood something essential. I never had one. What I had was proximity. And the moment I stepped back, the structure revealed itself. The ground had shifted, not because I pushed it, but because it was never stable to begin with. And once that happens, there's no rebuilding things the old way, only deciding what comes next. The compliance review didn't make noise, but it made impact. Banks don't shout. Regulators don't threaten. They ask questions, request clarification, and freeze movement until answers arrive. It's procedural, unemotional, and deeply unsettling for people who are used to their authority being unquestioned. Dana called me early Monday morning. They've restricted discretionary transfers, she said. Temporarily. How temporary, I asked. That depends on how honest the answers are, she replied. So far they aren't. I thanked her and hung up, then sat on the edge of my bed for a long moment, feet flat on the floor, grounding myself in the quiet. I didn't feel excitement. I didn't feel triumph. I felt steady. At work, the timing couldn't have been better. The regional lead role had placed me in the middle of a merger discussion that had been stalled for months. Two firms, competing interests, too many egos, no clear path forward. I listened more than I spoke. When I finally did speak, I outlined a restructuring model that redistributed authority without threatening identity. Clean lines, clear accountability, no ambiguity. The room went quiet. That would require some people to let go, someone said. Yes, I replied, but it would also remove uncertainty. By the end of the meeting, the model was adopted. As I walked back to my office, I realized something that would have startled me just months earlier. I was good at this, not because I dominated the room, but because I didn't need control to feel secure. I could see systems clearly because I wasn't invested in preserving them at all costs. That insight stayed with me, because that was the difference between me and my parents. They needed control to feel safe. I needed clarity. The call from my father came that evening. I almost didn't answer, almost. But curiosity won. This has gone far enough, he said without greeting. Yes, I replied. It has. You're damaging things you don't understand, he snapped. I understand perfectly, I said. I just don't prioritize the same outcomes. Silence. You've put us in an impossible position, he said finally. I leaned back against the counterphone pressed lightly to my ear. No, I said. I exposed the position you were already in. His voice lowered. What do you want? There it was. Not apology, not repair. Terms. I want transparency, I said, and distance. Distance, he repeated, incredulous. Yes, I said, formal, legal, respected. You're asking to be cut out completely, he said. I considered that. No, I said. I'm asking to be free. He exhaled sharply. You're being unreasonable. Then this conversation is over, I replied. I hung up before he could respond. 5 minutes later, Evan texted. You're enjoying this. I stared at the message, then typed back. No, I'm finished with it. That was the truth. The leverage wasn't the accounting. It wasn't the compliance review. It was my disengagement. People like my parents are trained to negotiate conflict. They know how to escalate, deflect, manipulate, threaten. What they don't know how to handle is someone who stops needing the outcome they're offering. Dana explained it to me later that week. They can't control you because they don't know what you want, she said. And that terrifies them. The next move came through their attorney. A proposal. They would restructure the trust. Not equally but visibly. I would be included as a named beneficiary. Certain assets would be reallocated. A public show of correction. In exchange, I would withdraw all requests and sign a non-disparagement agreement. I read the proposal twice. Then I forwarded it to Dana with a single line. No. She called me immediately. Are you sure, she asked? Yes, I said. This is a significant concession, she said. It's not, I replied. It's a performance. She paused. What do you want instead, she asked. I didn't answer right away. I thought about the apartment I'd chosen myself, the job I'd stepped into without asking permission, the quiet nights where my phone didn't control my mood. I want a clean exit, I said. From everything shared. Dana was quiet for a moment. That's rare, she said. Most people want inclusion. I don't, I replied. I want separation. The paperwork for that was different. More final. More unsettling. It meant relinquishing claims but also removing obligations. No future entanglement. No assumed loyalty. No access disguised as care. Dana drafted the counterproposal. It was brief. I would formally waive any future claims against family trusts in exchange for documented acknowledgement of prior exclusion, a neutral statement of separation, and a binding agreement limiting future contact to legal counsel only. When she sent it, she warned me. "This will feel like rejection to them," she said. "I know," I replied. "That's not my problem." The response was immediate. My mother emailed me directly, bypassing everyone. "How can you do this to us?" she wrote. "After everything we've done for you." I didn't reply. Evan left a voicemail. "You're choosing isolation," he said. "Don't pretend this is strength." I deleted it. 2 days later, Dana called. "They're stalling," she said. "They didn't expect this." "I know," I replied. "What happens if they refuse?" she asked. "Then we continue," I said. "I don't need their agreement to step away." That night, I sat alone on my couch, lights low, a glass of water in my hand. I thought about how often I'd been told that family was everything, that walking away was failure. What no one ever explained was the cost of staying, the constant self-editing, the pressure to absorb discomfort, the expectation that love meant compliance. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even hurt. I was resolved. And that, more than anything, was what they couldn't undo. Because once you stop needing permission to leave, no one can hold you hostage with belonging again. The leverage they never expected wasn't money or law. It was my willingness to choose myself. And that choice was already made. The refusal came 3 days later. Not dramatic, not angry, just cold. Their attorney sent a single-page response rejecting my counterproposal. No commentary, no explanation. Just a statement that my terms were unnecessary and disproportionate. I read it once, then set it down. That was the moment. Not because I was surprised, but because the last illusion dissolved right there. They were never going to acknowledge what they'd done. Not because they didn't understand it, but because acknowledgement would collapse the version of themselves they needed to protect. Donna called within the hour. "They're calling your bluff," she said. "It's not a bluff," I replied. "I know," she said. "Which means we move to the next phase." The next phase wasn't loud. It was administrative. We filed notice to proceed independently with a petition for declaratory judgment. Narrow in scope. Focused. It didn't accuse them of wrongdoing. It asked the court to formally recognize my exclusion and clarify my legal non-obligation to future family financial structures. It was clean. It was final. It removed ambiguity. Most people think legal action is about winning something back. Sometimes it is. This wasn't. This was about defining reality in a way that couldn't be rewritten later. Dana explained it plainly. This prevents future narrative control. No one gets to imply you walked away emotionally or irresponsibly. The record will show you were excluded and responded accordingly. I signed the paperwork the same afternoon. No shaking, no hesitation. Just my name steady on the page. When I left her office, the air felt lighter. Not because the conflict was over, but because my role in it was clear. I wasn't trying to be included. I was documenting my exit. That evening, my father called again. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail. "You've crossed a line," he said. "This will follow you." I deleted it. The next morning, Evan texted, "They're saying you're unstable." I replied for the first time in weeks. "Put it in writing." He didn't respond. At work, the merger closed. Quietly. Successfully. My name appeared in the internal announcement under leadership acknowledgments. No one asked about my family. No one questioned my composure. In systems built on clarity, results speak louder than rumors. The hearing date was set for the following month. No trial, no spectacle, just filings and review. Still, the impact rippled immediately. My parents' attorney requested a continuance. Dana declined. Relatives went silent. No more concerned calls. No more gentle pressure. When people realize they can't influence the outcome, they stop pretending they were ever neutral. One afternoon, I received a handwritten letter from my mother. Not an email, not a text. A letter. She wrote about memories, holidays, sacrifices. She wrote about how much she worried about me, how she only ever wanted to protect me. She didn't mention the trust. She didn't mention exclusion. She didn't mention accountability. At the end, she wrote, "I hope someday you understand why we did what we did." I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. Understanding wasn't the issue. Consent was. The night before the hearing, I sat alone in my apartment, documents neatly stacked on the table phone face down. I thought about how different this moment felt compared to every other confrontation in my life. No rehearsed speeches, no arguments, no need to be believed. The court didn't care about tone or intent. It cared about facts. And facts, unlike feelings, don't bend to authority. Dana met me outside the building the next morning. She looked the same as always, calm, focused. Ready, she asked. Yes, I said. Inside, the process was brief, procedural, efficient. The judge reviewed the filings, asked a few clarifying questions, and issued a temporary order recognizing my formal separation from all family financial instruments, pending final determination. It wasn't dramatic, but it was binding. When we stepped outside, Dana smiled slightly. This changes the landscape, she said. Yes, I replied. It does. My phone buzzed immediately. A missed call from my father. A text from Evan? What have you done? I didn't respond. Because the truth was simple. I hadn't done anything to them. I had done something for myself. I had taken a story they controlled and moved it into a system they couldn't manipulate. And in doing so, I had reclaimed something far more valuable than inheritance. I had reclaimed authorship. Once that happens, there's no going back. Only forward. The silence afterward was different. Not tense, not watchful. Empty. For years, my life had been punctuated by the subtle hum of family expectations, calls that required emotional calibration, messages that carried subtext, decisions weighed against how they would land. When that hum stopped, the absence felt almost disorienting. No texts from my mother, no updates from Evan, no carefully worded concern disguised as care. Just quiet. Dana confirmed what I already sensed. The temporary order had done more than protect me. It had disrupted the internal balance of power my parents relied on. Without informal access to me, without the ability to frame my choices as emotional missteps, their narrative had stalled. And when a narrative stalls, other people start asking questions. The fallout didn't arrive as confrontation. It arrived as consequence. My father stepped down from a leadership role he'd held for years. Officially, it was to focus on personal matters. Unofficially, it was because trust, once questioned, doesn't recover quietly. My mother withdrew from several committees she'd chaired. The same women who once praised her devotion now asked careful, uncomfortable questions. How could a family fracture so publicly without cause? Evan's position shifted too. Not immediately, not dramatically. But I noticed the change in tone when mutual acquaintances spoke about him. Less certainty, more caution. Control, it turns out, is contagious. When it breaks in one place, people start looking for cracks elsewhere. I didn't celebrate any of it. I didn't need to. This wasn't revenge. It was gravity. At work, my world expanded. I was invited into conversations I hadn't been before. Asked for input on strategy beyond my immediate scope. Offered mentorship opportunities. One afternoon, my supervisor said something that stayed with me. You don't carry unnecessary weight, she said. It makes people trust you. Unnecessary weight. I knew exactly what she meant. That weight had been my family's for a long time. I had been carrying it out of loyalty, not obligation. Letting it go had freed up space I hadn't known I needed. The final hearing date was confirmed for early winter. Dana explained that the likely outcome would be permanent recognition of separation with no further entanglement unless initiated by me. It's rare, she said, but it's clean. Clean sounded good. In the weeks leading up to it, my parents didn't reach out. Until one night my mother called. I almost didn't answer, but something told me this was the last attempt. Clara, she said, voice subdued. I don't understand how we got here. I didn't respond right away. Do you want to? I asked. She was quiet for a long time. We only ever wanted to help you, she said. I exhaled slowly. I believe that, I said, but help without consent is control. She didn't argue. You've changed, she said softly. Yes, I replied, because I had to. Her voice cracked. We're your family. I closed my eyes. You were, I said. Before, I was treated like a liability. The line went dead. I didn't call back. Not because I was angry. Because the conversation had ended exactly where it needed to. The hearing itself was brief. The court reviewed the compliance findings, the prior orders, the absence of dispute on key facts. The judge issued a final declaration recognizing my exclusion, affirming my right to disengage without penalty or presumption, and closing the matter. No applause. No speeches. Just resolution. Outside the building, Dana shook my hand. You handled this with precision, she said. Most people never get there. Most people never stop negotiating their worth, I replied. That night I went home and did something I'd never done before. I threw away old family calendars, holiday cards, photos I'd kept out of habit rather than affection. Not all of them. Just the ones that no longer told the truth. I kept one picture of myself as a child sitting on the floor with a book completely absorbed. That girl hadn't been broken. She'd been observant. I framed the photo and placed it on my desk. The next morning, I woke up without the familiar weight in my chest. No anticipation of fallout, no fear of reaction, just my life unfiltered. The system that had relied on my silence had collapsed, not because I attacked it, but because I withdrew my participation. And once that happens, there's nothing left to hold it together. What falls apart after that isn't family. It's illusion. And illusion once seen clearly never survives long. Chapter 12. What I Took With Me. 3 months after everything was finalized, I stood in my kitchen on a quiet Sunday morning, watching light move slowly across the floor. No phone buzzing, no calendar reminders tied to someone else's expectations. Just the sound of water boiling and the low hum of the refrigerator. Peace, I learned, isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with relief the way people imagine some dramatic exhale after years of holding your breath. It arrives quietly in the absence of dread. In the way your body stops bracing for impact. I hadn't spoken to my parents since the hearing, not because I was avoiding them, because there was nothing left to say. The legal separation did more than close a case. It closed a chapter of my life where I had mistaken proximity for belonging. Once the paperwork was final, the rules changed, not just for them, but for me. I no longer wondered how my choices would be interpreted. I no longer softened my language preemptively. I no longer explained decisions that didn't require approval. That kind of freedom is subtle, but once you feel it, you can't unfeel it. At work, my responsibilities expanded again. I led my first full acquisition review without oversight. When the board approved it unanimously, no one congratulated me with surprise. They congratulated me with expectation. That distinction mattered. I moved apartments shortly after choosing a place closer to the water. Smaller, quieter, entirely mine. As I unpacked, I noticed how little I brought with me from my old life. Fewer keepsakes, fewer inherited assumptions. The absence felt intentional. One afternoon, while sorting through a box of documents, I found an old birthday card from my father. Inside, he'd written, "We worry because we care." I stared at the sentence for a long time. Then I placed the card back in the box and sealed it shut. Some things don't need reinterpretation. They need context. I didn't become happier overnight. That's not how real change works. But I became steadier, less reactive, more selective with my energy. And something else happened. I stopped explaining my past to justify my present. When people asked about my family, I said, "We're not close," and let the silence do the rest. I didn't fill it with apologies or qualifications. I didn't perform grief to make others comfortable. That I realized was another form of control I had released. A few weeks later, I ran into someone who used to know my parents well. She looked at me carefully, then said, "You seem different." "I am," I replied. "In a good way," she added quickly. I smiled, yes. That night, I sat at my desk and opened my journal. I hadn't written in it since the legal process ended. I hadn't needed to. The urgency was gone. But I wanted to mark the moment. I wrote this. I used to believe love meant access, that if I stayed close enough, patient enough, agreeable enough, I would be protected. What I learned instead is that access without respect is not love, it's control. I paused, then continued. I was told my sensitivity was a weakness. It wasn't. It was perception. I saw things early. I felt shifts others ignored. The mistake wasn't that I noticed, it was that I doubted myself. I closed the journal and sat back. For a long time, my story had been framed as conflict, as estrangement, as loss. That framing was incomplete. What I lost was conditional belonging. What I gained was authorship. And authorship changes everything. If you're reading this and something in it feels familiar, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not difficult because you ask questions. You are not disloyal because you draw boundaries. You are not ungrateful because you refuse to be managed. Sometimes the most powerful decision isn't confrontation. It's withdrawal. It's the moment you stop negotiating your worth and start protecting your dignity. The people who benefit from your silence will call that selfish. Let them. Silence, when chosen, is not weakness. It's clarity. And clarity is how you choose yourself without apology. That's the only revenge that ever lasts. If this story resonated with you, share your own. Tell someone what you stopped tolerating and what you chose instead. And if you want to hear more stories like this one's rooted in quiet strength and hard-earned self-respect, stay with me. Some truths don't need to be shouted. They just need to be told once clearly and lived after that. The last document arrived by mail on a Tuesday afternoon, folded cleanly stamped, unremarkable. I recognized the envelope immediately. Court seal, final confirmation. I didn't open it right away. I made tea first. Stood at the counter while the kettle hissed, watching steam rise and vanish. When I finally broke the seal, I read the letter once, then set it down beside the mug. That was it. No more pending matters. No future obligations. No implied roles waiting to be resumed. The separation was complete. What surprised me most wasn't relief. It was how little space the whole thing took up in my mind afterward. I had expected a crash, an emotional reckoning, some delayed grief that would finally demand attention. Instead, there was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when something has ended exactly when it should have. In the weeks that followed, my life didn't become extraordinary. It became normal in a way it never had before. I woke up without scanning my phone for missed calls. I made decisions without pre-running them through imagined objections. I spoke plainly even when it made people pause. At work, I declined a project that didn't align with my priorities. No explanation beyond, "I don't have capacity for that right now." The words felt solid in my mouth, no apology attached. I noticed how often people expect women to cushion their boundaries. I stopped doing that. One evening, while unpacking the last box in my new apartment, I found an old notebook from my early 20s. Inside were lists, goals, plans, versions of a future I'd quietly abandoned because they didn't fit the life my family envisioned for me. I didn't feel sad reading them. I felt curious. Not everything I had set aside needed to be reclaimed. Some ideas belonged to a younger version of me who was still asking permission. But others still mattered. They felt intact, untouched by the years I spent minimizing myself. I tore out one page and taped it to the inside of a cabinet door, not as a promise, as a reminder. I ran into Evan once, months later, by accident. A grocery store aisle. We made eye contact. He nodded, uncertain, like someone greeting a stranger who looked familiar. I nodded back. We didn't speak. There was nothing left unresolved between us. The relationship had ended the moment I stopped playing my part. What remained was just recognition. Later that night, I thought about how much energy I had spent trying to be understood by people who benefited from misunderstanding me. That was the real cost. Not the inheritance, not the status, not the access. The cost was years of internal negotiation. I don't think my parents ever saw themselves as cruel. They saw themselves as careful, responsible, protective. But protection that removes choice isn't care. It's containment. I don't hate them. I don't need to. Indifference is enough. The last thing I wrote in my journal months after everything ended was short. I wrote, "I am not hard to love. I was hard to control." That truth settled into me slowly, then completely. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself somewhere along the way, here's what I want you to take with you. Pay attention to how often love shows up with conditions attached. Notice who benefits when you stay quiet. Ask yourself whether peace in your life requires your absence or someone else's discomfort. You don't need a dramatic exit. You don't need a confrontation. You don't need permission. Sometimes the most decisive act is choosing not to return. That's how you reclaim your time. That's how you protect your dignity. That's how the story ends without you losing yourself. If this story spoke to you, let me know. Share what boundary you're learning to hold, or what version of yourself you're finally done performing. And if you want more stories like this told without shouting, without spectacle, but with clarity and consequence, stay here. Some endings don't come with closure. They come with freedom, and that's enough.